Hello and welcome to another episode of Skin Like a Rhino, the podcast by Elvie in which I, Tania, get to meet some incredible women breaking old taboos and new ground. In today's episode, I am delighted to be talking with Zoe Blaskey, the founder of Motherkind, a platform which helps women through the process into becoming parents. It includes podcasts, toolkits, coaching, and most recently, a book called Motherkind. And today, Zoe and I will talk about that process and how we, not just as women, but all individuals, can go through a series of coaching or questions in order to try and work out really how we can better live our lives according to our values and find that elusive goal of happiness. Hi, Zoe. Welcome to Skin Like a Rhino. I'm so delighted that you could join us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of Elvie, so very happy to be here.
Well, likewise, with Motherkind. And I think both of us are a new breed of female entrepreneurs, aren't we? Kind of bossing it, starting our own companies and also talking openly about parenting. But for those of the listeners who don't know about Motherkind, could you maybe tell me in couple of sentences what Motherkind is, and then I'd love to talk about why you started it.
Yeah, so Motherkind is essentially a new toolkit for new times, because the times that we're mothering in right now are radically different from even a decade ago, let alone 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. And yet what I see is many mothers still using an outdated toolkit, believing that we can do it all, have it all to the highest standard, that we should feel guilt, that, we should be saying yes to everything. That's the sort of old way, as I call it. And what Motherkind really it does, and what I try to do, is I've interviewed, over 500 of the world's leading experts in motherhood, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and I've put all that together into a toolkit for modern mothers. So I cover everything starting at Matrescence, which is the process and adjusting to motherhood, all the way through to how to feel confident, how to completely let go of the idea of work-life balance and think more about boundaries, how to manage your energy, why self-care doesn't work and what does. So it's a complete toolkit for the modern mother.
I've heard it being referred to as the Bible for new mums, which, and having had a look, I do think it's also the book that you've just published. It's just incredibly practical and gives women very sort of simple advice, I think, about how they can feel better. Is the name Motherkind, I'm guessing, is that to do with being kind to ourselves? Because I love that name too.
Yeah, so the name came because I was unbelievably hard on myself in early motherhood, which I now know is a really, really common experience. And what I needed most at the time was my own kindness, and actually kindness from the workplace, society, institutions, and everyone around me. What I saw was often the opposite towards mothers, particularly new mothers. And I really liked the play on mankind, Motherkind, which I really liked. So Motherkind represents an ability for us to really give ourselves compassion first. There's always the foundation that I talk about in Motherkind is you have to be kind to yourself first. And that doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook or lying on the sofa. Sometimes being kind to yourself is making really hard decisions. So that's where it came from. And interestingly, I didn't like the name when I first came up with it, but now I absolutely love
it. Which bit didn't you like, the mother bits or the kind bits?
I just didn't love it. I thought that would be a great working title, and I'll probably change it. And actually, as time went on, I started to absolutely love it, which I do now.
Yeah, and kind, it's one of those words which is so sort of underrated in society, right? Or people sort of say it sometimes in a slightly derogatory, they're kind or something, but it's so important. And I suppose my question then is, if we need to be kinder to ourselves in terms of our expectations, isn't some of it about also adjusting our expectations of the word success? Because you mentioned success before, right? The fact that we want to be successful. Have we got that term completely wrong when it comes to parenthood?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have quite a patriarchal view of success. If you say success to someone, they will tend to think about how much does that person earn, what car do they drive, what does their CV look like? And I think that's a very old-fashioned view of success. It's very patriarchal. I think success is completely individual to every single person. And some people say to me, do you feel successful, Zoe? And my answer is always yes, because my version of success isn't about, how much Motherkind turns over. I haven't gone down that route. I haven't sought funding. I haven't tried to grow my business that way. Success to me is that it's flexible. I'm on a mission. I'm serving, but also I'm really present with my family. But every single woman, and in fact, every single mother would give a different answer to what success is. But the important thing that I don't see mothers doing enough is asking themselves that question, because what success means to you before parenthood should change, I believe. So the question is, what does success mean to me now? What does success mean at work? What does success mean in parenting? We rarely think about that. What sort of a parent do I want to be? When my kids look back on their childhood, or when they think about our relationship, what do I want them to think about? What does success mean in my relationship? Which often changes a lot in parenthood. Success to me now in my relationship is far more about how we're sharing the load, how are we communicating, how are we dealing with our inevitable resentments, than what it used to be, which was like, how much fun are we having? And, how many parties are we going to in our 20s? So I think it's super important to update your version of success. And there is no right or wrong. But the most important thing is that you know what success looks like for you. What does success mean to you?
There's a lot to unpack there. And also I'll then also answer your question, but I think what you're talking about is something quite philosophical, right? Which is around how much we're living it according to our values.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people don't ask themselves those questions, right? And I know you talk a lot about that in the book, this idea of should. So I can give you an example, actually, just, now I've stepped down from being CEO of LV. It's been 2 years, and everybody's question always is, what are you doing next? What are you doing? What's your next big project? They're expecting something bigger. And my success now has changed. I want to spend more time at home. I want more time for myself. I've worked so hard for 11 years at LV. But I find myself still not being able to quite say that, because I feel like the expectations, I should be saying something, you have to be quite brave, right, to go against what society expects as well all the time. But I have got to that position. I also feel like for me, it's taken a journey to actually think through what are my values and what it is that makes me happy. And I've also feel like I've been very lucky to even have the space to think about that, right? Because I completely agree with you, but I feel like it's not just parents, right? Wouldn't you say in society these days, most people are sort of wandering around doing things because they should, rather than what's making them happy? And that starts all the way from school, right? It's happening with our kids.
Yeah, exactly. That's absolutely right. And I think, it's not just about parents, but I think when you become a parent, it does really put a magnifying glass on that, because suddenly you have this other huge, massive priority on your time. And you have to think, whether consciously or unconsciously, as in you're sort of lurching from one thing to the next, never feeling good about anything, which is what I see a lot of as well. You have to think, how does this new huge part of my life shifted everything around me? I talk about this word matrescence a lot, which means the process of becoming a mother. It's essentially the same as adolescence, where a lot changes and it's a huge developmental phase. And I think of it like a jigsaw puzzle, that matrescence really throws up your life. And if every piece of the jigsaw puzzle is like work, friendships, relationships, how I feel about myself, what I do on my spare time, how I care for myself, every element of your life makes up that jigsaw puzzle. Matrescence really throws it up in the air. And I think that matrescence is going through that process of putting it back together again, making lots of mistakes along the way. And of course, it changes again, as we were saying before, with every age and stage. So the most important thing is to have some ability to continually do a little bit of self-reflection. Otherwise, it's really easy. I speak to so many mothers whose kids now are much older, like 20, 30, and they say, I wish I'd have asked myself some of these questions when they were young. So I feel like while we've got the chance to do that, it's super empowering, and it doesn't take long. It's not like, you're writing out 3 morning pages or anything like that. It's super simple questions that you can think about as you're doing other things in your day.
So when you talk about these women who also wish that, as their kids are growing up, and I see it too, right, especially when the kids start secondary school, are you seeing that they wish that they'd sort of carved out more time for themselves, or they felt they've done parenting wrong, or
they just wish that they'd have asked themselves that question around should? Am I doing this because I really want to and I really believe it? Or actually, am I doing it because I think I should? Whether that's around work, whether that's around staying married, whether that's around certain friendships, whether that's around how much they give to people around them. I think there's a real awakening that happens to women, particularly around perimenopause age, where they think, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be in that friendship group where it's all about, getting drunk and gossiping about other people. I don't want to be part of that anymore. Or actually, this relationship isn't fulfilling me anymore. I think I'd rather be on my own. Or actually, I wish that I had the courage to lean more into my career. Or I wish that I'd had the courage to step back. Yeah. Like you're doing. So I think there's a million answers to that question, but the most important thing is to ask yourself the question. The quality of your life and the quality of your experience through anything, but especially motherhood, really does depend on the quality of the questions that you ask yourself. Otherwise, it's so easy to sort of go into that unconscious place where we're just on a hamster wheel of doing, going, and, believing that at the end of some magic part of the next promotion or the next house with an extra bedroom or the next big holiday, that happiness resides there. And my experience and having coached thousands of mothers is that isn't the case. There isn't this sort of, when I get that, then I'll be happy, which is why I think so many of us can get caught in that trap. Me too.
Gosh, no, you're absolutely right. I just sort of try not to get into a well of self-reflection on whether or not I'm happy right this second. So you're sort of asking all these questions. But I mean, so you used to be, you are still a coach, right?
Yeah.
Is coaching, talk me through, what was it that attracted you to coaching? You make it sound very simple. Is it a case that, if you do spend enough time with women and just give her a little bit of the tools, then she's able to just actually look at things differently, you talk about new changes. I suppose it's a very pivotal moment in women's life. It's quite easy to adapt and affect. I mean, that must be quite rewarding.
Absolutely. And that's, I'd say, we think about zone of geniuses a lot in coaching. Like, what are you absolutely amazing at? And I think that's what I'm amazing at, is that I've managed to distill all of these tools into super simple coaching interventions that do not take very long to set you off on a completely different trajectory. So I had a corporate career before Motherkind, and I was good at it. My last job, I headed up all the marketing for a big city insurer, and I had a team of 25. But the feedback that I continually got was that I was the best at team development, and that was the bit that I loved. And I actually coached a lot of people to exit the business, which started to become quite unpopular, because I'm just always have been obsessed with people feeling aligned and happy and living according to their values. And so I'd been trained in coaching a long time, but then when I had my postpartum experience and realized, oh my gosh, there is such a need for a new toolkit in motherhood. And to be honest, I thought I would just do kind of one-on-one coaching. I thought I'd go into corporates because I had lots of contacts there, but I realized quite quickly that I wanted to reach people on a far, far, far bigger scale. And that's where the kind of books and the podcasts and the platform came from. So I actually don't do any one-to-one coaching anymore, but I have a team under me that do that one-to-one coaching. But coaching is a modality that I think is hugely misunderstood. I think it's underrated. You can have an intervention with someone for 30 minutes using coaching skills and you will see a radical change, as opposed to therapy, which is a completely different modality, often takes a lot longer, depending on what the therapeutic intervention is. So I love both, but for me, I find coaching incredibly powerful, because coaching has at its foundation a belief that the answers are within you and that you don't need anyone to tell you what to do. You need someone to help you, give you a tool or a map or a guide to help you unlock that truth for yourself. And that's my core belief. That's my core belief. And that's why I struggle sometimes with therapy, because they can place a model on you, whereas coaching's very different to that. It's very person-led.
Yeah, I mean, I've had different coaching at different points in my career, mostly executive and so on, and it just helps you just get a different perspective.
That's right.
Ask questions and then you work it out. But actually, I was looking at Motherkind, so obviously I see now that you don't coach yourself and now you have a team. But I'm now thinking, with my tech entrepreneur hat, we should actually chat separately, because surely there's a space where you could, yes, you've got your toolkit, you've got your podcast, but you should also be able to do coaching in an interactive way through an app, right, with new moms. Like, if you really want to get scaled, because ultimately, I'm guessing your belief is all women and probably all new fathers too, right, should have access to this kind of coaching approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'd love to have that. I'd love to have that chat. And I'm super inspired by what Dr. Becky is doing at Good Inside. And she's, I'm a big fan of Good Inside, and she's a big fan of Motherkind. And I love what she is doing with that platform. If I'm honest, keeping Motherkind at the size and scale that it is has been very intentional on my part, because my husband has been growing and scaling a business and has just exited from that. So I knew that both of us couldn't do that at the same time. Even though I think I'm capable of doing that, I've definitely got the ambition to do that. I just knew that that wasn't the young family setup that I wanted. So I very much kept Motherkind at a scale and a reach that I knew I could manage around the kids, around the pickups. But that's changing now. So, and I think having that very clear intention that I decided very early on, and I've been offered, lots of big opportunities that I've turned down for that reason. So I think businesses grow in seasons, and it's definitely going to be Motherkind's season to grow very soon.
That's very exciting. I kind of wish now I'd talked to you like 5 years ago, because I didn't have it. Yeah, sometimes you have the opportunities, right? Sometimes you have the sense of, I had a sense, for me, I became a parent, and at the same time, Elvie, I suddenly had all these opportunities, and I really felt I couldn't say no. So I just said yes to everything.
It's hard.
But always had this line of sight that at some point, when I got to a certain point, I would change roles, because I didn't want to miss out too much. And I kind of got there, but definitely burnt out along the way, terrible insomnia, definitely feel like I missed out on a lot of the kids, and definitely feel in the end, I bit off more than I could chew, right? Took in too much money and so on. So I'm quite jealous of the fact you've managed to intentionally also keep control. I'd like to talk about work-life balance, because I've heard you also say that it's kind of a misnomer, right? We need to be setting boundaries. And I think that's obviously what you've done quite well with Motherkind. And part of that, the privilege I think you and I have is we're able, because it's our own businesses, to do that for a while, right? And then at a certain point, I lost that control because I had a lot of investors, and that's when you also get more stress, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen many of my friends do the same route that you did, Tania, and I was very lucky that I could see that line of sight and what that would mean. And I know that I started Motherkind for freedom. But there's so much privilege in being able to make those choices. And what I've done with the Motherkind toolkit is that wherever you are, even if you are currently not in paid work, the tools are incredibly supportive to help you make some of those more intentional decisions.
So I was about to ask you, what advice would you give to women who don't have the privilege we have and are in a job which is not being supported, they're burning out, they've got too much going on? Then I realized I shouldn't ask you what advice, because coaching is about asking questions. So what questions should they be asking themselves?
Yeah, so the most important thing is, if you are in that situation where, say, you are in a paid job, maybe in a corporate, and it isn't your thing, so you have less freedom over it, the most important thing is to ask yourself some super simple questions. The first one is to get clear of, what are you in control of and what aren't you in control of? Because if you're not in control of something, you can waste so much time and energy wishing it was different. I wish my boss was different. I wish the culture of this organization was different. I wish I hadn't signed this contract. I wish I'd done a different degree. There are so many people who come to me and come to my coaching team in that mindset, and it is a drain on your energy, and it creates stress. So stress is really about resisting what is. That's where so much stress comes from, when we resist what is. So you want to get super clear on what you're actually not in control of, and then move far more to the more empowering side, which is, what am I in control of? Okay, to some extent, I'm in control of the career path that I choose to have. I could think about, where are my transferable skills? Where could I do this job in a different way? Could I lower my expenditure in some way so that I can work less days, or start out in a different industry? And there's a plethora of options, way too more than we could go through on this call. But that's where you want to start. What am I in control of? What am I not in control of? And then when you've got that what I'm in control of column, you want to think about, what is one step that I can take this week to move me forward this week, and just one step. Because the absolute most powerful thing about coaching is that it breaks down a really big challenge like I'm burning out in my job. It isn't sustainable with my family, which is often what someone will come to me with. I can help someone break that down step by step so that week by week they move forward. And within a month or even less time, they've completely transformed often either how they think and feel about it, or they're taking really concrete steps towards a change.
And it sounds to me like if you're able to do that, that's like changing your whole mindset about everything, right? In terms of accepting things as they are. And how does like positive psychology, this idea constantly, we should be, there's a real trend, I don't know what's called, it's optimization, constantly optimizing ourselves, or if we just believe something, we can achieve it and so on. How does that marry with this idea of what's in our control and what's not? Like we're in a society, I'd say we're quite often not accepting what's not within our control. Right? We're always being encouraged to change things.
Yeah, and I think that's dangerous to some extent, particularly for mothers, because we can't change the childcare policy. We can't change that the cost of childcare is completely prohibitive until your child gets to 3, if you're lucky to get some free hours, or school age. So yes, it's not helpful. It's far, far, far more helpful to think about where I actually do have some control. Now, mindset is super important. Mindset is about essentially belief. Like, I believe that I have the ability to change my current situation. If you don't believe that, you're never going to, because actually creating change takes an awful amount of energy, resistance, resilience, as you and I know. It takes huge amount of resilience. You're going to get knocked back. You're going to have to maybe write 50 job applications to get that one flexible job that's going to suit you. If you deep down believe this isn't possible, or I'm not capable of it, it's going to make it much, much, much harder. So mindset, without a doubt, comes into it. But what I really am not a fan of is toxic positivity. So I am not someone who would ever encourage a mother to find the silver lining, to, look on the bright side. I think, there is an awful lot about modern motherhood that is incredibly challenging. And I work really hard to validate that for mothers. That doesn't mean that we get ourselves disempowered and we throw our hands up in the air and go, it's too difficult, we can't do it. It's the opposite. It means that we say, this is really difficult. And the moment we recognize that is self-compassion in action, because we're saying, this is really difficult. I'm not failing. The system really isn't set up to help me succeed, but I'm going to try my best anyway. So it's the both and, it's the validation and then taking the action.
Hi everyone, Tania here. Just a quick favour. We'd love your feedback. If you have a moment, it would be great if you could give us a star rating. It helps others to find our podcast and means we can continue to get brilliant guests for you. Now, back to the good stuff. So this toxic positivity, I've not really heard that term so much. Just talk me through how you see it and how it plays out for parents. Yeah.
Toxic positivity is where if someone came to you and said, oh, I'm just absolutely devastated. I've just been made redundant from my job and I'm super concerned about paying my mortgage next month and, the nursery bills. And if that person said, well, at least you can get a job, you can get a job, look at your experience, that would be toxic positivity. Because what you're not doing is validating someone's feelings. What you are doing is basically completely dismissing how they really feel inside. So
and we have to do that to ourselves too, right? We have to lean in then to the pain. Is that part of the same?
Yeah, exactly. Because if we just deny what really is and we just manage to convince ourselves that, it's not really painful, that does not work, because feelings, they don't work like that. You have to feel them how they are in order to move through them. And by the way, that's a really important parenting skill as well, is that so many parents think that you can say to your child, oh, don't be sad, or there's nothing to be scared of, and that will soothe them. It actually does the opposite. So the most powerful thing is to say, yeah, I get that you're sad, or I hear that you're scared. If you think about it, if you went to a friend and said, I feel super worried about this thing, and said, oh, don't be worried, there's nothing to be worried about, you would feel completely unseen, to the point where you'd feel invisible. Like, does this person even listen to me? So we need to do the same with ourselves, the same with, mothers around us, with our colleagues, and with our children, is this ability to really sit and listen and validate, and then ask a question like, do you want some solutions or advice, or do you want me to just hear you? Whenever someone comes to me, not in a coaching capacity, because that's a different relationship, if a friend comes to me, I'll always say, what do you want? Do you want me to just listen, or do you want us to work out some solutions together? What's going to help you the most? Because we're so used to jumping in with advice and you should do, and have you tried, and let me send you this podcast. And often that isn't what people really need or want.
Yeah. So with children, well, I suppose two things. One is, there's something like, well, I feel this in myself, like you just don't want your child to feel suffering and pain, so you kind of want to jump in even more, right? But at the same time, I suppose that as a parent, that really isn't your role, right? Surely, how would you describe the parental role? I suppose coaching is an approach to parenting as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I use coaching every single day in my parenting. I always, when I get a question from my kids, ask a question straight back. Never give an answer. Mummy, why is that person ill? I don't know. Tell me, what do you think? Like always, because then I get a sense of where their knowledge is at, what they think about something. It's rarely what I would have answered.
Yeah.
The next question. And then they'll say, oh, because, I saw them go into hospital. Okay, it's interesting. What do you think happens in hospital? And then
you must be so patient.
I am patient.
Because I'm like, I just want the quickest, move on type thing sometimes. But I know, yeah, you're right. That's coaching takes longer, I suppose, in the short term, but better.
Yeah, and it's it's not always, is it? It's just generally I would be like that. Of course, not always. If I'm on a deadline and we're rushing somewhere and they ask me a question, I might just be like, get your shoes on, let's go. Of course, that's real life as well. But I think if we can infuse more kind of curiosity with ourselves and with our children, then that is what builds that skill of, self-knowledge. And it's kind of full circle to what we were talking about. So many people are just living based on the shoulds, what they think they should be doing, what they think would make their parents proud. There are so many women in their 40s that I know are still working to make their mum or their dad proud or make them feel like they've made something of their lives. So, by asking those coaching questions that enable us to think about, okay, what's important to me that we do with our children as well, that's where it all starts. That's where it starts, so that hopefully our children won't go off in these trajectories in their lives that actually realise that isn't really what I wanted to do and that's not authentic to me.
Yeah. And matrescence, I'm now thinking, it's one of these terms, right, which I think is so useful to try and describe the changes that a woman goes through as she becomes a parent. My concern sometimes is a bit that it's so focused on the woman, and if we're opening up a slight can of worms, if we're saying there's literally biological changes and changes in the brain that happen to women to adapt them from an evolutionary point of view towards parenthood, say more than a man. So it'd be interesting to hear what you think about the gender thing, but also is one of the reasons that I'm getting it's because it's allowing us also to face it. It's the opposite of positive toxic positivity, in that we're actually facing into the fact that this is a hard change. It's something we can kind of name.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because adolescence, I use the analogy. Imagine if as a society, we didn't tell teenagers that they were going to go through their puberty, through their adolescence. Imagine if we just didn't tell them that. And then one day their voice started changing and their bodies started changing and they started to feel this rage that they couldn't describe, and they started to feel like their relationships were changing and they felt like a really different person. But imagine if none of that had been talked about or known. That is what we do to mothers when we don't talk about matrescence. That's what we do. And what most mothers do is they do what's known as self-silencing, which is where they say, it must be me, I must be doing it wrong, because when I look around, because everyone else is worried about it must be me, so everyone else is going, it's amazing, and there's joy and florals, and I've never been happier. That sort of prevalent message, and that is changing, but that is absolutely still the prevailing message. Then women decide that they're doing it wrong and it's their fault and they're failing. And that's what breaks my heart the most. That's what I'm on a mission to change. I want every mother to know that adjusting to motherhood is a process, just like adolescence is a process. And if you are supported through books and podcasts like mine, then you emerge more resilient, stronger, clearer about who you are. Just like if you're supported properly through your puberty, the same thing happens. Whereas when you're not, it can be really challenging. So that's the first thing with matrescence that I think is so powerful. And I love that it's all encapsulated in one word. And I love the comparison to adolescence because everyone instantly gets it. It makes so much sense. There's not a mother that I describe that to that doesn't go, oh my gosh,
yeah,
oh, I wasn't failing, I wasn't doing it wrong. It is meant to be a really bumpy time. It's a developmental phase. It's meant to be full of highs and full of lows. It's like a roller coaster, just like adolescence is. You're meant to question everything. Your identity is meant to change. And then when I describe all these things to women, I really say, you're doing it right. If you're struggling through, you're really doing it right. Often tears come and relief. And so it's incredibly powerful. And on the gender divide, yes, I mean, it's fascinating because fathers go through patrescence. Mm-hmm. So similar brain changes, not exactly the same, but similar brain changes. And actually it's more about, it's not necessarily, obviously the pregnancies through the brain changes that come with the pregnancy hormones are gendered, but actually in postpartum, it is the brain changes are the same for the primary caregiver, regardless of gender.
Reminds me a lot about the debates we have in femtech, women's health tech. Like, I love the term femtech because when I started LV, it didn't exist. So
no, I love
nothing
it.
To call.
I love it. Yeah.
But it's very controversial. A lot of people will point out, similar to what you could with Matrescence, they're like, well, it's not inclusive. It doesn't include men's health and so on. But my point is, right now, there was no term before, and having something allows us to talk about it. And hopefully there'll be a point in the future where we don't need femtech because it will be integrated into bigger health tech too, right? I feel with Matrescence too, it's so important to focus on what's happening to the women, and particularly, like you said, the physical hormonal changes. It seems though there's quite a lot of the process of becoming a parent also, like you're saying, some of it's similar for the man or the woman or whoever is the primary caregiver, right?
Yeah.
We're just in an impossible situation at the moment, aren't we? Where we want to have the careers, we've fought hard to have certain careers. And yet we're in a situation where we've never really had two working parents working and there's no childcare. We can't afford, that the societal pressure is not there to support two working parents with children. And, I feel like what we also need to focus on, and I know you're not saying this, is we need to get men, right, to increase the burden of care. They need to be more shared parental leave. Not enough men are taking it up and so on. So I suppose I find it a bit of a balance, isn't it? We need to focus on the woman and the specific needs of a woman, but at the same time, make sure the debate doesn't focus too much on the woman. That's my personal view. I don't know what your sense is.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think part of when I teach and, go into corporates and talk about matrescence is just that a huge part of matrescence is thinking about the support system around those parents. The reason that I focus on matrescence is because I think when I look at the data and the statistics for who is struggling most in the transition to parenthood, it's mothers. And it just makes sense to me that was my experience too. So I am going to focus on a project and a mission that I have personal experience of. And when I look at the data, it's 92% of mothers that feel invisible. It's not 92% of men that feel invisible. When a man becomes a father, he on average gets a 30% pay rise because he is seen in an unconscious bias way as more responsible. He's got more financial, he's more responsible man, he's developed into a father, he is more likely to get 30% pay rise. Women on average lose 25% of their earnings. So yes, it is super important to focus on parents in general, but for me right now, the group that I see are seriously struggling, and make no doubt about it, this is a crisis, are mothers. So I really unapologetically put my time, energy and focus there. But of course, part of it is how do we educate fathers and society at whole with matrescence? What do we do about the low take-up of shared leave? What do we do about the fact that most inequality gets set up on maternity leave because it is the mother who gets that sometimes 6 months, sometimes 9 months, sometimes a year off. She then becomes, by default, the default parent, the primary caregiver, knows what to do. And then she starts writing the lists. And suddenly you're in this setup that then can take a while to unravel. So I think about all those things endlessly, but I am also a realist. And the group that are struggling the most with their mental health are mothers. So that's where I
It's
focus.
so funny. It's exactly the same debate around the term femtech, because everybody's always like, yeah, people often just like, why not men's health and so on. It's like, well, there's a crisis right now in women's health, not men's health. Let's fix women's health, and then we could be academically look at both. But
right, if it was the other way around, I don't prefer women to men. Like if it was the other way around and men were struggling, and I was getting data and statistics telling me that, you know, the highest risk for a man post becoming a father is suicide in the first year, I'd be jumping on that. But that is not the data that I'm seeing. Make no doubt about it, both genders are struggling. But for me, my absolute passion sits with supporting mothers.
Have you coached men then as well?
Yeah.
So when you compare trying to change mindset, because my guess also is when you talk a lot about the should and the expectations around career and productivity and parenthood, is it quite different for men? Or in some ways, are some of those views around the should even more entrenched for a man?
I mean, it's so...
around career, possibly, and women, parenthood, because of societal, historical values.
That's right. I think that so much of this sits in our subconscious about what a good mother does and what a good father does. And I think that it's changing in terms of what a quote unquote good father does, for sure. But often it's those unconscious messages and those unconscious beliefs that a good father provides and a good mother stays at home, to be completely binary about it. Often we have those narratives sitting, not even in our conscious awareness, that are driving our decisions. So the first thing that I always do when I sit with a client is ask them that question, like, what do you believe a good mother is or does? And I would ask a father exactly the same question, and I would start from there. And it's so dependent on, you know, the family setup, what they witnessed in their home. That is so powerful, because our beliefs about the world and how things should work get set up by the age of 7. So often when someone becomes a parent, it's those blueprints of beliefs that get blueprinted onto how they think they quote unquote should be. So that's the first place that I always start at. And, you know, it's complex. It depends so much on what that person's history is, whether they've got childhood trauma, whether they've been raised by a single mother, or whether they were raised by a dual earning family, or a mother that they never saw work and a father that they never saw. You know, it's so complex. But the most important thing is to ask that question. You know, what do you believe? What do you believe? And what do you want to change from the generation before you? You know, what cycles do you want to break? I'm really into coaching on how do we change things for the next generation, and what does that look like for you? And it's so individual.
That's something I ask myself as a parent, right? Like how I find myself falling into the traps of how my parents behave, which I hated. And then it's just trying to consciously not be like your parents somehow, and how we end up sometimes behaving like our parents.
Well, we always will, because we always repeat what we know, unless we consciously make the invisible, which is all these patterns and synapses and how things work, until we make the invisible visible. We go, okay, what do I want to do differently? We will always repeat.
But then looking at generations, if you read the media, like the general consensus seems to be that our generation of parents, we've got children at the moment, that we're helicopter parents, that we're all over them all the time, compared to our parents' generation, who you get the impression they were just laissez-faire, just didn't really parent us. What's your sense on what's behind this?
I mean, the studies on helicopter parenting are fascinating. It's definitely more pronounced than it was in generations previously. But I think what is so different to our generation is that we have more parenting knowledge than at any other point in history. And that makes us anxious. You might think it would cause the opposite. Okay, we have so much parenting support. It doesn't. It does.
I was expecting you to say the opposite.
It does the absolute opposite. Okay. It creates an anxiety and a pressure. So what I am super always thinking about is how do we live in this sort of coexist in this world where we know more than ever about the importance of the first 5 years, for example. I don't think that definitely wasn't understood in a couple of generations back, that actually those first 5 years, certainly the first 1,000 days, do create the blueprint. They do. So how do we know that, but also not put ourselves under unbelievable pressure, well, that's where we have to stop thinking about us as individuals and start thinking more about how do we get more support around those first 1,000 days, around those first 5 years for parents. And that, of course, is the work that the Duchess is doing amazingly, Princess Catherine, with her foundation. So that, you know, change is happening there, but it's absolutely a huge tension point that I see, that we have more access to parenting information and books than at any other point in history.
I think I've also heard you say that, the parenting industry is just massive, it's just getting bigger and bigger, but that's not necessarily a positive thing. Is that sort of what you're also alluding to here, or is that a different point?
I think it is a complex thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say whether I think it's good or bad, because I think it depends on how the advice is given. I think it depends on how nuanced it is, how supportive it is, but I think it's just a fact. And I think it's important for parents to really observe and know that we know more than we ever have. And so how do we not use that as a way to put ourselves under immense pressure?
Yeah, and it can. Well, I would go for. I mean, it can be harmful. Obviously, it can be, right? If you get the wrong advice.
That's right.
I read "Contented Little Baby," and because I'm a bit of a control freak, I was like following all the rules, waking my baby up when I didn't want to wake up, trying to get the baby to sleep, and it was so stressful. And I felt like such a failure. And then actually, similarly, even tech, right? Like at LV, we've thought about doing baby tech, all this tracking, and we're like, actually, it's going to make people more anxious. Like,
I'm pleased you said that. I'm pleased you said that. I get offered quite a lot for baby tech brands to sponsor the podcast, and I rarely do, because I feel like you don't need to know the temperature of your baby at 5-minute intervals through the whole night. I'm not sure that is helpful given what I know about parental anxiety.
Yeah, it's not. You want it. We've thought about this quite a bit. You want it to be like a smoke alarm. Like if something really bad happens, you want to know. But otherwise, you just don't want to know anything.
Exactly.
But just switching track just a tiny bit to, I suppose, the tools, because I really think some of the tools that you have in the book are just so helpful. One of the, some of them around how to put down boundaries, I suppose, rather than just trying to constantly find a balance. It would be great to just hear if there's a simple tool that listeners can try for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So balance is we just need to get rid of that idea. Like there will never be a time where you will find either work-life balance if you're in paid work, or balance between your different children, or balance between yourself and your children and your family and your friends. It's just, if you think about what balance means, it's a moment when everything is in perfect order, and that is just never going to happen. Even if you got that for an hour, some curveball will fly in. Like you and I were talking before we started recording this, an illness curveball, a family member being ill, a new work project meaning you're going to have to dive in there, a house move. There are any number of huge curveballs that come in. So we just need to get rid of the idea of balance, and we need to think far more about boundaries, which are the limits that we put in place in the different areas of our lives, which allow us to focus our limited time and energy where we need to at any given point. So, for example, I have always had a boundary of no work emails after 8 p.m. I've had a boundary of, I used to have Fridays off with my little girl, and for a while it was awful because I would be on emails trying to firefight. Sometimes I'd take a meeting if I thought it was important enough, and I'd be with her and I thought, this is a disaster. What boundaries do I need to put in place? So instead of thinking, how can I get more balance, which is just, it's a self-defeating question. Mm-hmm. You want to ask yourself, what boundaries do I need to put in place? And there are boundaries, internal boundaries, which are the limits that we set with ourselves. I'm going to get to bed at 10 p.m. 3 nights a week. Limits around your phone, limits around alcohol, limits around sleep. These are the really big ones that mothers often say they need the most help with. Boundaries with family, boundaries with friends, boundaries with time. And then there are external boundaries, which are, boundaries that we might put in about how much we are willing to help others, boundaries around family visits, any area in your life, you can think, do I need a boundary here? And a bit of a shortcut, which is a sign that you need one, is where you might feel resentful.
In theory, I know that we all need to be good at boundary setting, but actually even just by you just turning it into a simple question, like what boundaries do I need here?
Yeah.
It is very clearly defining. In some ways, it's back to your point about we have to accept what's in control, what's not in our control, and accept that things are hard.
Yeah.
Because the boundary is basically saying what you're going to say no to. in some ways, right? It's going
That's
to be something you're not going to do, which is hard.
Or put a limit on. It doesn't mean that
Yeah.
you have to say no to it. Say you're struggling with, you know, a friendship, and you feel like it's too one-sided and I'm always giving and I'm not getting enough back. And actually at this season in my life, I haven't got time for that. It might be that you don't cut that friend out. It might be that you just have a boundary in place, which is actually, I'm only going to speak to them on the phone once a week. It's all in my book. If, you know, I've really tried to get specific on boundaries, like how you might communicate that. What happens if someone ignores your boundary? How to get into compromise with boundaries. It's all in there. There's a whole chapter on it.
But I suppose on managing energy, just last question on the tools, because I think that's something you talk really well about too, just for any sort of simple tools that people can think about. Because managing energy, I suppose we always just think we're tired as parents all the time. We don't think about how to manage our energy levels.
That's right. And this, you know, this really came about because at the time, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a huge conversation about self-care for mothers. And I always hated it because I feel like self-care has come to mean two things we have very little of often. One is time and one is money. And I thought this sort of ethereal idea of self-care around bubble baths, and it's rooted in no science often. And mothers were telling me, I just feel like it's another thing that I should be doing, that I'm beating myself up against. So I really dived into some pretty hardcore, heavyweight research on this and thought, what are often some of the top executives doing? And actually came out from Harvard around, it was about managing your energy, not your time. It was an executive coaching paper. And I thought that is it for mothers. That is it for mothers. It's about managing our energy, because often how much sleep we get is outside of our control, right? You know, that 2 columns, often how much sleep we get is outside of our control. So how can we manage our energy? And there are absolutely specific things that we do that drain our energy. It's like having too many tabs open on your iPhone. You know, when you need to go through and flick them closed. Absolutely, there are things that we do that drain our energy. And on the other side, there are things that we do, often simple, small things that boost that. It's like plugging the phone in. And so, again, like super simple tool in the book for how to work out what are those givers for you and what are those drains for you, and how can you be more intentional about using boundaries to do less of the drains, being more intentional to do yes of the givers. So mothers tell me, you know, I worked out that when I do a 5-minute walk around the block every day or every other day, it really gives me a lot of energy. And I figured that out. I knew it kind of worked, but I hadn't actually got that super clear about it. So now I've got that in my diary every day, and it's completely changed how I feel. These are not kind of rocket science type changes. They're just very, very simple, small changes. But I think when you replace that tool with this idea of self-care, it becomes practical. It becomes something that you can actually do, and it costs no time or money.
Yeah, and I get it. And it's also part of the similar coaching philosophy, right? Well, like do just one small change a week.
That's right.
Well, yeah, then Zoe, thank you so much for joining us today. And
You're welcome.
I think for the listeners who haven't read Motherkind, the book just came out, is it this summer, isn't it?
It came out in August.
Summer 2024.
Yeah.
But before I let you go, just the question I always ask all of my guests, which is, the podcast is called Skin Like a Rhino, which is all about how we, but particularly as female entrepreneurs or female trailblazers, have to often ignore a lot of naysayers, and how we can build that inner resolve. Is there any moment during, I suppose, the time that you've created Motherkind where you've really felt you had to dig deep? And how did you yourself, how were you able to apply your own coaching tools on your own ability to resolve the issue?
I mean, many times. As I'm sure you've had to. I think when I first started Motherkind, it was 8 years ago. No one got what I was doing, particularly the press. And, you know, there's only a parenting category on iTunes. So I had to put it in there because there was no other category. But I kept saying, this isn't about parenting. I'm not going to teach you how to wean your baby, or about the naughty step, or about bottle or breast, or that is not what I'm not a parenting expert. I'm an expert in helping you, the mother, through this massive transition that you're going through. And no one really got it. The mothers did instantly. And that's how the podcast grew. But certainly the press did not understand it. And I've had to work really hard. And now it is changing. It is really changing. And I'm so happy for that. But yeah, when I first started, no one understood what I was doing. They would just say, so it's parenting. And I'd have to say so many times a day, no, it's not parenting. It's about what happens when a woman becomes a mother. And I would get blank faces back at me. When a woman becomes a mother, what are you talking about?
Well, Zoe, thank you so much for persevering. And I completely agree with you. I think we both started out, were you about 8 years ago? I think I was 10
Yeah,
10 years ago.
I was 8 years ago. Mm-hmm.
That's the reason to be so optimistic, right? Things are changing so much, the fact that we're having these conversations. So thank you so much for joining me today.
You are welcome. Nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, great to meet you, and we should continue the conversation. Thanks for listening to Skin Like a Rhino. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to leave us a star rating. Your feedback means the world to us and helps others discover the podcast. Until next time.